My name's Darcy, for those who don't know, and I'll be doing the sermon today. And we're going to, as Mel said, we're going to be discussing the chapters in Romans chapter 10 and chapter 11. But before we can do that, I'm going to give you a quick recap of what we learned last week in Romans chapter 9. Because chapter 9 is very important, and we learned there that we learned this concept that not everybody that is part of the group of people that was selected to receive the promises of God ended up actually getting the promises of God. The reason for this wasn't because God failed to deliver on his part to make the promises happen, but because that group of people rejected God. So as Paul, the author of Romans, is explaining this process so that the people reading, and some of the people reading hadn't received the promises of God like they thought they would, they're reading this and he's explaining it so they can understand that being saved, right, receiving grace and mercy from God isn't based on the things that you do to earn being saved. It's not based on that because God has given it as a gift to everybody. God has given it as a gift to everyone. The group of people that choose to accept this gift, God calls these people Israel. Everybody has an opportunity to be a part of that Israel group if they want to be. In the other camp is a group of people that were the descendants of a guy named Jacob. Jacob, who had been the receptor of God's promises in the past. These people thought that it was their right as descendants of Jacob to claim these promises. It was their birthright. They thought that by learning enough, studying enough, trying hard enough, that they could earn these promises through sheer effort. But it doesn't work like that. So you have two groups. You've got this literal Israel group, the literal descendants of Jacob, who thought that they could earn favor with God. And you've got the other Israel, the group of people that receives God's favor as a gift and chooses to accept it. And it's this group that chooses to accept the gift. That's the group that we can be a part of. Everybody can be a part of this spiritual Israel group. You can even be a part of spiritual Israel if you belong to the literal Israel group. Right? Paul, as an example, was a descendant of Jacob and therefore was a literal Israelite. But through his journey, as we read it in the Bible, he met Jesus on the road to Damascus and realized that the whole time he'd been reading the Bible and trying to study and earn his way into these promises, he realized that the whole time, even though he knew it better than everybody, he realized that he'd missed the point the whole time. He'd missed what it was really talking about. His whole time studying the Bible, he'd missed the overall message. It was a bit like me. I don't know if you've ever read the story like The Lorax by Dr. Seuss or watched the movie. It was an amazing movie. You should watch it. First time I watched it as a kid, it was a really neat film, funny, it's got very entertaining. It's about the story of a guy who makes a product, and he sells the product, and he's really successful, and he has a great time, and there's also some trees and stuff, and that's fun. But then as I got older, right, and I started to analyze it a bit harder, right, like English literature studies in high school, like, okay, what's actually going on in this movie? Right? I see underneath all that fun, all the singing, all the dancing, it's actually a bit of a comment on society, right? The destruction of the environment and the removal of morals in order to make money, right? That's what it's actually about when you really look at it, right? And this is what happened with Paul in the Bible. It's the same story that he's reading, but he realizes actually this is what it's really about the whole time, as soon as he started to look at it through that proper lens. And so once the scales had been removed from Paul's eyes, he saw this Bible in a new way. He saw all the ways that it actually pointed to Jesus the whole time. And Paul went from identifying as a literal Israelite, as his way to earn God's favor, to accepting the fact that Jesus had died for his sins. Jesus had died for his sins, so his whole debt of sin had been paid for. Paul then became a spiritual Israelite and encouraged other people around him to do the same. And it's this encouragement that makes Romans such an important book for us today. We find ourselves now in a very similar situation to the church at the time was finding themselves in. we now are wanting to follow this example and become part of this spiritual Israel group. This group is the group that receives mercy from God. And so Paul describes this process by which people become receivers, partakers of God's mercy. He says it's similar to grafting as it is in farming. Right? This blew my mind when I first learned it. Right? So I don't know if you know much about gardening. I don't know that much about gardening. But grafting is a process where you have a tree and you cut out a branch from that tree and you take this branch and you attach it to a new tree. And it grows on the new tree. That's crazy. How does it grow? Like, if I cut off your arm and then put it on someone else who didn't have an arm, you would not expect that arm to, like, grow and function. That would blow your mind. So, like, don't be like, yeah, of course it grows, Darcy. You don't know. So you take, like, the branch of an apple tree, you take it, one apple tree, and you attach it to a new apple tree, and it's just a matter of, like, tying it together and, like, casting techniques similar to what they use in, like, medicine when you break a bone, right? These two plants then grow into each other until the stage when, much later, you can remove the cast that you had on the joint, and that you just have one tree. It's fully a part of the new tree. It's awesome. And this alone was incredible information to me, learning that, like, how cool it is that you can attach two trees together and they become one tree. But not only that, right, it gets even cooler. Take a step further. Say that you have two different types of apple tree, right? You've got like a Pink Lady and a Granny Smith apple tree, right? The two most generic apple types. You take you take one of the branches, right? You take your, I don't know, we'll say the Pink Lady branch from the Pink Lady tree, and you attach it to the Granny Smith tree. You would think that the new branch would just start to grow Granny Smith apples because it's been attached, but it doesn't. It continues to grow Pink Lady apples. So now you have a tree that grows two types of apples. That's insane. It grows two different types of apples. And there's no limit, by the way, on how many times you can do this. I did a lot of research. You can have like a tree with like 8 different types of apples if you want to. There's like people that have done this. You can go online and you can buy a fruit salad tree. You can literally buy a fruit salad tree. It's incredible. So that blew my mind. But what does this have to do with the mercy of God, right? Why does Paul use this analogy of grafting and align it with God? Jesus says, if you'd like to turn with me to the book of John. John's one of the Gospels, if you find like Matthew in the New Testament, and then goes Mark, Luke, and John. And in John chapter 15, verse 1 to 17, Jesus says that he is the vine, the one true vine. Jesus is the vine and we are the branches. If we're really connected with God as we should be, then we should be producing fruit. The fruits of the Spirit sort of fruit, right? The fruits of the Spirit is not a coconut. It's not a lemon. The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and no. Yeah, I did the actions wrong. This is why we need to do a storm call again. Right? These are the fruits of the Spirit that we produce that are present in our lives when we are walking closely with God, when we're connected with Him. This is why the Bible says we shouldn't judge other people, right, for their actions, but we can be fruit inspectors. We can be fruit inspectors. We can look at the sort of fruits that people are producing in their lives and discern for ourselves what sort of vine they're connected to. If they're connected to Jesus, if they're connected to the true vine, they're going to be producing the fruits of the Spirit in their life. We can also look then at our own lives and ask, what sort of vine are we connected to? Are we producing the fruits of the Spirit in our own lives? If not, what kind of fruits are we producing, and how can we make sure that we're connected with Jesus? According to the Bible, originally, you and I, we are not attached, we are not part of the true vine. We were separate, we're cut off. But accepting God's mercy allows us to be grafted into the family of God in the same way that a tree branch is grafted into the apple tree. This is important because being grafted in means that the ability that we have to produce fruit, this good fruit that we want in our lives, it doesn't come from our own roots. It doesn't come from our own strength. it comes from God. Paul says in Romans chapter 11, so you're in John, go next to Acts, and then Romans. Romans chapter 11 and verse 18 of Romans chapter 11. It says that we shouldn't boast against other branches because we should remember that we don't support the root, but it's the root that supports us. We've been grafted in. It's not our own roots. As I was reading through Romans and pondering this analogy of the vine and being grafted in, I was blown away by the amount of little spiritual lessons that could be drawn out of this particular passage. I thought it would be a shame not to take this opportunity to share some of the lessons that I picked up, just some of the ones that I picked up when I was reading. The biggest one that jumped out was what we just talked about, right? This idea that all the fruit, the energy that we as the branch receive, it doesn't come from any effort by the branch. It comes from the roots of the tree that we're attached to. It comes from Jesus. It comes from the true vine that we're grafted into. This means that not only can we not boast about how much fruit we produce, it means that we can't judge others for how much fruit they produce either. Another lesson that we get from this analogy is that it takes a long time to graft a new branch fully into the tree. And even though the gardener might make the decision to start grafting early on in the season, right? The effects and the results and the actual fruit-bearing process takes a long time before you start to see some results. And this lesson is especially relevant today, right, for Emma's baptism. She's getting baptized as a public expression of her desire to be grafted into the true vine. But this is just the first of a long process, the first step in a long process that really, it takes a lifetime. Some people expect that they're going to get grafted in and they're going to instantly produce fruit. But in reality, it's actually the hardest time for the tree branch in the initial process when they're grafted in. It's a time when you've got to learn that you can't rely on your own roots anymore. You've got to start relying on the true vine. You've got to start connecting yourself in. And if you don't form a good connection. If the tree branch doesn't realize its need to rely on the main tree, it doesn't connect in well and it won't produce good fruit. So it's Emma now being exposed to new challenges and new environments that this is going to grow you from this point. And ultimately, we can produce more fruit when we're attached to the true vine than we ever could in our own efforts. A third lesson is that just because you're grafted in doesn't mean that you can't then be grafted out again. Paul writes in Romans chapter 11, verse 19 to 23. He says that branches were broken off so that we could be grafted in. Indeed, it was because of unbelief that they were broken off. And you stand by faith. But therefore, don't think highly of yourself, but be humble. For if God did not spare the original natural branches, then he wouldn't spare you either. Therefore, consider the goodness and also the severity of God. On those who have been cut off, severity. But on those who believe, consider the goodness. Because they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, if they turn away, they can be grafted back in again. God is able to do that. And so therefore, we are never too far removed from the tree that we can't be grafted back in again. Even if you were once broken off, God can still reconnect you. God can still graft you back in. And you can remain with him if you remain faithful. Jesus says with the vine analogy in John 15 that if we remain in him and his words remain in us, we can ask for whatever we wish and it will be given to us, not for our glory, but for the glory of God, so that we can bear much fruit and show ourselves by our fruit that we're disciples of God. Again, it's the fruit that we bear that reveals what vine we're attached to. And if we remain in God, he remains in us. The last spiritual lesson that I want to focus on today, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the lessons you can get from Romans 10 and 11. But I want to focus on the fact that when the tree, or when the branch is grafted into the tree, right, like we learned before, it doesn't produce the same fruit that the original tree did. It produces its own fruit, right? It's taking the energy from the new tree, but producing fruit in its own way. And this is absolutely incredible, and it means that every single branch, even though we're all connected to the true vine, even though we're all part of the same tree, we will all produce in our own unique way fruit for God. In our own unique way. Different fruits come along in different seasons. So just because you see other branches producing fruit in this season doesn't mean that you're a failure. It just might not be your season. Your fruit comes at another time. It doesn't mean that you're worse. It doesn't mean that they're better, because we've all come from a tree other than the one that we are now grafted into. We all have unique gifts and talents that we bring. Now that we're grafted into God, now that we're grafted into the true vine, we produce our own fruit for the glory of God. No one has the right to tell you that their way of producing fruit is the only way that you can ever produce fruit. Everybody will be unique in the way that they produce fruit for God, and this is true throughout all time, from the beginning for infinity future. Turn with me to the last book of the Bible, at the very back, Revelation chapter 22. It's the last chapter in the Bible, Revelation chapter 22 and verse 2. The author of Revelation, John, is describing heaven, and he sees in the middle of the street of the new city, he sees the tree of life. And he says, it bears fruit every month. Every month it bears fruit. There's not a time, right? Even though trees bear fruit in season, there's not a time when this tree does not bear fruit. At the center of heaven is a tree that has all different kinds of fruit on it. And even is in heaven then, this analogy, this idea that we've all been grafted in and we're all going to produce fruit in our own season if we're connected with God, still rings true. Even in heaven, you're going to be able to produce fruit for God in your own way through the energy of God working through you. So especially today, as we acknowledge and celebrate Emma being grafted into the true vine, I would like for each of us to take the moment and reflect. Are you grafted in to the true vine? If you are, how can you produce more fruit for God? What do you need to do in your life to make sure that God's energy is working through you? If you're not yet grafted in, what steps can you take today to be grafted in with God? I encourage you, if you feel so convicted, to have a chat with myself or Jeremy or any of the leadership here about what steps you can take to be grafted into the true vine. Because ultimately, we want to have baptisms like this as much as we can. And it's an awesome celebration to have someone be grafted in today. So thank you for listening.